Everything will be all right when people stop thinking of the United Nations as a weird Picasso abstraction and see it as a drawing they made themselves. Those words, spoken by Dag Hammarskjöld, the second United Nations Secretary General in 1953, resonate with me. I once saw the United Nations as a pillar of stability, but I've come to realize it is not an ideal monument that should be admired from afar. It is an instrument that must function under pressure when politics fail. Today, that instrument is at risk of failing. With wars paralyzing the Security Council, military expenditure rising, climate change accelerating, and AI reshaping societies, the United Nations increasingly resembles that fragmented Picasso painting Hammarskjöld once warned against. Choosing a new Secretary General in 2026 is not a routine transition. It is a test whether the United Nations can still function in an increasingly broken world. At the heart of the Secretary General's office lies a paradox. It is one of the most visible positions in world politics, but it has no army, no budgetary authority, and no votes. And yet the Charter provides a pivotal tool for leadership. Article 99 empowers the Secretary General to bring to the attention of the Security Council any matter threatening international peace and security. It was only used 3 times, in the Congo, in Tunisia, and most recently, in Gaza. It does not guarantee outcomes, but it gives to the Secretary General the power to refuse the normalization of political paralysis. For my generation, good tools for leadership matter deeply. We did not create these institutions, but we are the ones that will live with their ability to solve contemporary problems. And we are not asking for perfection. We're asking for leadership that uses existing tools even when politically inconvenient. This brings us back to Hammarskjöld's Picasso. The United Nations may appear fragmented from a distance, but that is a misperception that we must challenge. When we recognize it as a drawing that we are collectively responsible for, it becomes what it was meant to be, a tool for action. Therefore, the question before us in this panel is this: are we ready to choose a leader who can pick up the pen and help us redraw the lives of the United Nations? Someone who can recognize dangers to world peace early, speak plainly when silence is safer, and act in line with the Charter when others hesitate. With that question in mind, I'm pleased to open this panel and introduce our speakers in order of which they are seated. As a moderator, we're happy to welcome Vuk Jeremic, Editor-in-Chief of Horizons and former President of the United Nations General Assembly. We're honored to welcome Felipe Calderón, former President of Mexico. We're glad to be joined by Vera Songwe, Chair and Founder of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility and former United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. From our very own PSIA, we'd like to welcome Terezi Hiklova, Master Student in International Security. We're grateful to welcome Achim Steiner, Chair of the Hamburg Sustainability Conference and former Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. And it is a pleasure to welcome Hina Rabbani Kar, Chair of the National Assembly's Foreign Affairs Committee and Pakistan's 26th Foreign Minister. And I urge you all, engage with the panelists, ask them questions, and most of all, be critical. Mr. Jeremic, I give the word to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very inspirational beginning to this panel. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be back. It's great to be back after a number of years in this theater, moderating a panel at the Youth and Leaders Conference. I was actually a panelist at the inaugural Youth and Leaders Conference that took place in 2016. And it was full of very interesting people. President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was speaking. Arantxa González, as the executive director of ITC was speaking, and there was also a very young and energetic and promising young minister at that time. Yeah, you'll hear what I'm talking about. His name was Emmanuel Macron. He was speaker in the panel here at the Youth and Leaders Conference. So I was very humbled to share the podium with all these people. And I was there in my capacity at the time as the candidate for the United Nations Secretary General. I ran in 2016. I was the runner-up. I was the guy who lost in the last sixth round of voting. And I remember very, very vividly the debate here at Butmi, and also debates around the world that was surrounding this election process for Secretary General. The name of the conference, to begin with, back in 2016, was The Art of Diplomacy, the agenda for the next Secretary General. This time around, it's the Secretary General for a Broken World. So it's a very different, I would say, atmosphere in which this election is taking place. Back in 2016 was arguably the high watermark for multilateral diplomacy. It was just after the Paris Climate Treaty was adopted, after the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed. Things were, going well in the world. They were difficult, situations here and there, but by and large, international relations were conducted in an orderly way, and the UN stood, at the very heart of what was at that time going on in the world. We are now experiencing a different era. I like to call it, my students from Sciences Po know it, I call it the geopolitical recession. I believe that geopolitics is just like the economics, a cyclical affair. They're good, periods followed by bad periods. Well, 2016 was a good period. 2026 is, I am afraid, a geopolitical recession. So we are in the search for the next Secretary General of the UN for a broken world. So I will start with Mr. President Calderon. Is the world broken, in your opinion? And if it is, then why do you think that the world is broken?
Well, thank you. First, thanks all for the honor to be invited to this meeting. Yes, so if the world is not exactly broken, what is broken is the international order. We are passing from international order based upon its rule-based order to power-based disorder, if I can say that. And we are changing from the international law, the conventions of Vienna and other big treaty, the creation of NU, and those rules that we were creating during decades after the Second World War now are changing dramatically. And we are assisting a complete different model of international organization. We are passing from international law to something closer to Game of Thrones or something like that. And we are waiting for a new leader that could be the King of the North. And the King of the North that is appearing is not exactly what we were expecting. It's a different guy. So it's not Jon Snow who is coming. The problem with that is it's a matter of leadership. If we were in business as usual, we can say that according with the principles or the inspiration of regional rotation and the suggestion made by the President of the Security Council and the President of the Assembly, the new Secretary General must be a woman, and a woman coming from Latin America. And I have a couple of good candidates. Michelle Bachelet is one, Patricia Espinosa is another one, the former Minister of Ecuador is another. But definitely we are not going to that point. I hope we can have an elections of Secretary General. But it is possible that that order, including the regulation of the United Nations, will be challenged for the current leadership in the world. So yes, the world's still surviving, but the international order is completely broken. And we are facing now the tradition of international law we know to a new thing based in power. based in this idea of the spheres of influence, and this idea about who is going to have the largest army, who is going to dare to break the rules, either in Greenland, either in other parts of the world, or we are facing, and I will close with that, I'm sorry to extend, but United Nations was created after the Second World War. And this Secretary General will be elected before the Third World War, and I hope that this process could avoid that. But the leadership that is required to fix the international order is beyond the election on business as usual basis of the new Secretary General.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And now I'm going to move to my dear friend Hina. By the way, for about 3 years, I was the youngest foreign minister in the world. And then Hina became foreign minister of Pakistan. I had the privilege of working with her both as foreign minister of Serbia and as president of the UN General Assembly. And I remember in our official meetings, we touched upon the future of the UN. We talked about Security Council reform in particular. A lot of people are saying that perhaps the most visible inadequacy of the Security Council's composition is the fact that some nuclear powers of today are actually not members, not permanent members of the Security Council. And I can think of at least 2 in your part of the world. What is your position when it comes to the future of the UN? Can it actually survive without this most neuralgic issue being addressed face on, the future composition of the UN Security Council?
Okay, a pleasure to be back at SciencePo, and sorry, Vuk, he's still not forgiven me for overtaking him as the youngest foreign minister. That was a decade plus back, and he still hasn't forgotten. But we will start from there. Okay, so it's interesting because I thought you kind of read my mind, because I was about to say, and this is the worst thing you can do to the people who organize, and my great friend and someone I look up to, that I think it is named wrongly. The question that we are asking is the wrong question, because it's not the characteristics of the United Nations Secretary General which is flawed by any means. It is the way the United Nations was made post-1945 that is perhaps flawed. And the biggest flaw in that is that while we seek democratic order everywhere, and while we are willing to go to war for democracy in countries and kill and maim and mutilate people for the sake of democratic order, we are not willing to follow democratic order in the governance of the world. Isn't that a bit crazy to many people? Meaning, why not project the same values in the governance of the world as we do in the governance of nation states? We're willing to literally go to war because some countries are not democratic, some countries are not able to hold the rights. And in order to kind of prove that, it's interesting because as I was doing some research for this session, I came across these last 2 tweets by the current Secretary General. So if you were to ask me what characteristics must the new Secretary General would have, I would say no one can perhaps have characteristics which are better than that of the current one. But does that change anything? Absolutely not. And why doesn't it change anything? Because of the way that Security Council is made, and because of the veto-wielding powers' absolute lack of will to fix the world, and because of their absolute desire and commitment to make it more and more and more broken, and because of what Philippe said, to continue to go on the trajectory where their power projection and the military strength will basically manage or determine what happens in the world. So it's not the Secretary General doesn't know what to do and he's not using the right tools, as you said. The right tools may be used, but when one country goes to veto, and we've seen this in the case of the most contemporary wars. We saw on live screen what happened in Palestine, and we had one country repeatedly vetoing any Security Council resolution. Now you go to the General Assembly, and this is what really explains the structure of the broken governance order. You go to the General Assembly, whether it is on the case of Ukraine or it is on the case of Palestine, the vote is always in the right direction, and by a huge majority of nation states. So what does that tell us? That there is no will, that the way it is structured, it is almost structured to fail. And then the other thing I think about the United Nations is, and many of us, Arencha included, has been involved in one way or the other, at least, I have to, in the UN reform, representing our countries one way or the other, right? And every time you try and reform the UN, what you end up doing is creating suprastructures over existing structures which don't really work, which are not legitimately required for the current world as it functions. Okay, so what has changed since 1945? I mean, we're living in a new world order. There is social, the social media, artificial intelligence, the war for artificial intelligence, who will do what? Climate change, all of these are what you should be vying for if you wanted to be leader of the world. Who is vying to be the leader of the world by coming up with new rules around it? So really, it's not the broken UN. And I absolutely feel very, I hate it when people say, oh, the UN is broken. The UN is not broken. The UN is the UN. We as nation states, and especially the P5 countries, have not done their role in reforming the UN. And because you asked specifically about Security Council, I will come to that and just say the following. If any of us thinks that being a nuclear state or being a country which has the largest economy or large economies or has the largest number of people should ensure that we become more undemocratic in our governance structures and give them an in on having a veto-ish power, less veto, more veto, we are basically saying that we will continue to not learn any lessons of history and go and absolutely do no reform. And I'm just going to end this, with just to make the point by reading out what the current Secretary General of the United Nations just told us yesterday, I think. He said, the United Nations Security Council stands alone in its authority to act on behalf of all member countries on questions of peace and security. It alone adopts decisions binding on all. No other body or ad hoc coalition can legally require all countries to comply with decisions on peace and security. We all know what he was referring to. Its obligation is universal. Its responsibility is singular. That is why reform is essential. That is why we must act without delay to enhance the representation and effectiveness of the Security Council. And then another thing that he said was that peace firmly anchored in international law, peace that endures because it tackles the root causes of conflict, not just its symptoms. We are continuously, Rook, in this world, tackling with the symptoms while allowing the root causes to become deeper and deeper and allowing conflict to fester because we are ensuring that the root causes just become more and more blatantly obvious to everyone, anyone who is actually obliged to the universality of international law. And I said last, but I would like to say another thing, please. That, there was a time that people used to argue about whether it should be international law-based order. Our ambassador sitting over here knows. So, or rules-based order. And now Philippe just gave us a very good line, power-based order. So, third world countries would say international law-based order, not rule-based order. And now we're talking about, no, none of that. Now it's power-based order. So it's the world that is broken, not the United Nations.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting take, and one could probably argue that it has always been a power-based order, but that the power was distributed perhaps differently in comparison to what we have today. But now let's move to the youth. I am going to ask Theresia, from the perspective of youth. You were a UN youth delegate, if I'm not mistaken. What kind of Secretary General does the UN need in view of your generation?
As we've heard throughout the summit, the UN is facing a multitude of crises, but I would say that the one crisis that the Secretary General can impact maybe most directly and should tackle first is the crisis of legitimacy. Now, I might put this a little bluntly, but I think if the UN wants to stay legitimate and relevant, then the world needs to stop speaking about the rules-based international system as if the world still played by those rules. In the past decades, we have seen selective enforcement, we've seen double standards, we've seen great powers bypassing norms as they see fit. And so I think it's time to finally admit that this narrative or story, which has mostly benefited much of the Western world, is not what was promised. And so I think that what follows from this broken world, as the title of our panel suggests, is that the international world will become two-speed. So on one track, we will have countries that will use coercion and rule breaking as a regular tool of statecraft. And on the other track, we would have countries that still seek cooperation based on shared rules, standards, and values. There is a saying that if you're not sitting at the table, then you're probably on the menu. So that's the reason why I think that the latter is what would most small and middle powers would probably opt for, because unlike the great powers, they cannot afford multilateralism. And I think actually some of the agreements that we've seen recently of the European Union with the Mercosur, for example, or most recently with India, are good examples of that. And so when we're thinking about the next role, new role for this next Secretary General, I think the major role is that this person will need to, most of all, reflect this new reality and protect and renew the relevance of the United Nations as a platform for cooperation in this fragmented world. I think in more academic terms, what I really liked recently was when the Finnish president Alexander Stubb termed or coined the term values-based realism. So that would mean such cooperation which is value-based and principled in its dedication to the UN Charter, the protection of human rights, protection of sovereignty, protection of territorial integrity, restraint of the use of force, but also such cooperation, on the other hand, which is also pragmatic and realistic in a sense that we need to respect diversity and we need to respect the fact that cooperation at times might be more important than just perfect consensus on everything. So in practical terms, I know I might be running out of time by this time, but I just think that the Secretary General should use their narrative power and just name reality as it is. Because since the UN obviously doesn't have hard power, then the main leverage the institution has is legitimacy. And second, and maybe even more importantly, I think that the Secretary General should act as this coalition enabler when the Security Council is blocked. Because whoever the next Secretary General is, I think they will not be successful by waiting for Security Council unity, but they will be successful by mobilizing coalitions according to areas where cooperation is still possible. So that could mean humanitarian access, climate action, or AI regulation, AI governance. And one last point that I would like to say, as our dear Dean Arantxa Gonzalez said yesterday during her opening remarks, we have really tried many different things already. We have tried an activist, Nobel Prize winners. We have tried seasoned professionals, less seasoned professionals, but who we still have not tried is a woman. And I think there has been countless research done on the fact that women in leadership roles, and let me quote Harvard Kennedy study. When researching women in leadership roles, they found that they tend to be more trustworthy and more effective in restoring confidence. There was also a study or a literature review, major literature review in the Global Health Journal, which compounded 194 studies, which essentially said that women tend to have stronger institutional performance, collaboration, and ethical governance. And that is exactly what the UN needs right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a lot of talk this time in 2016. I remember that the time has come for a lady to be a Secretary General. It's really peculiar that so far in the race, if I'm not mistaken, there's only one person who officially declared to be running, and that's Rafael Grossi from Argentina. It's a man. So that's very interesting. Maybe the ladies are having smarter tactics this time round. But let me shift to Vera, and I want to ask you about Africa. And there is a lot of disappointment when you talk to African leaders lately about the UN, about the rules-based order, I don't think that there's too much nostalgia in Africa about what we usually brand as a rules-based order. But in your opinion, in the next decade, given the situation as it is, do you think that for African nations, it's going to be UN or the African Union as a more important multilateral body addressing the challenges and needs of the nations of Africa?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me start, first of all, by thanking Arantxa, who's a dear friend and a charger in, I guess, the multilateral system, and I'm picking my words, a believer in that. And of course, it's a pleasure to be on this pristine panel in discussing these issues. I think two things. I think maybe just to go back and then to the question of whether it's a broken world. I think it's an unmasked world. It's, if we just assume that there was music playing and we all had masks on, we've danced with the masks for 40, 60 years, and then the music stopped and we took off our masks and we realized that our partners were not the people we believed that they were. That is where we are today. It's not broken. We've just taken off the masks. And as Mark Carney said, we have been living within a lie. Actually, I don't know, many people are congratulating Mark for his speech, but Mark said something very interesting. Mark said, we all knew we were living a lie, but we decided to continue playing the lie because it was advantageous for us. The question is, who is us? Right? And I think that is the biggest question. I think many people are citing Mark's speech, but people miss that point, that we all knew it was a lie, but we played it because it was advantageous for us. The mask is off now, because some of us who knew it was a lie and it was advantageous for us, it no longer is. And so we are able to begin to talk about it. And I think that is really where we are today. It's a question of trust. We have always been talking about trust, but there really was no trust. There really was never a values system. We never had a value system, if we're going to be very honest, right? And I think the foreign minister said it, honey, you know, if you look at the Security Council, we don't have democracies on the Security Council. What's the value system in the Security Council? It's not a democracy. Forget about how we vote in the Security Council, just the members of the Security Council. They were not Democrats, right? They were not living in democracies. And so I think for Africa, two things are happening today. The first is a lot of the things that are happening, and Arantxa, many of us have been talking about this since COVID. The first unmasking was COVID, when we realized that it really was not a values-based system. And the African Union came together, put the resources together, and provided COVID vaccines for Africa, because the rest of the world said to Africa, wait. When we have finished vaccinating ourselves, we will come to you. They did not realize that Africa could raise the resources and get the vaccines on its own, which we did through the African Union. And only when we did it, did then the rest of the world come and say, oh, we can now help. This is the value-based system that we want to go back to. I don't think it's a good one. And so, yes, the African Union is going to become a very important part of the game, but it does not mean that the United Nations is no longer important. I think I see this as a very critical moment, not because the United Nations is broken, but because the United Nations is finally unmasked. And we, your generation in particular, has the chance to reform this United Nations in a way where we are not hugging notions that we all believe are lies, but that are actually hugging notions that are intrinsically correct. And I think one thing that your generation has that we did not have was the leveling of the playing field on information. It is extremely important, because we cannot tell you, I cannot tell you today that I'm wearing a red jacket, because everybody can tweet me and see that I'm not wearing a red jacket. And you can tweet me from China to Zimbabwe to Bhutan. This was not the case when the United Nations was formed, and this was not the case 20 years ago. So I think with information, we can unmask the lies, and hopefully that we can begin to build a United Nations that is based on truth, on fact, and on accuracy.
Thank you very much. And finally, to Joachim, I'm going to ask you a very hypothetical question. I remember last American election, and I remember that one of the most critical moments in that election was when Kamala Harris was asked this question: if you were Joe Biden, if you were the president of the United States, what would you have done differently? And her answer was nothing. And a lot of pollsters believe that this was one of the critical junctures in the American elections. So imagine the following situation. There is a high-level official of the UN right now, essentially in the administration of Antonio Guterres. And that person, he or she, decides to run for Secretary General. And he or she asks you for advice how to answer the question. If I get to be asked the question, what would you have done differently from Antonio, Madam or Mr. Candidate for Secretary General? What would be your answer?
Look, that's a very elegant way of trying to corner me into a very nice trap, which I'm not going to fall for. Let's see who that person might be who will emerge, and then I'm certainly going to talk to them if they ask me, but I will do so behind closed doors. But I think your question, nevertheless, and what you're probing from all of us, I think is this sense of, is it the individual who, like a knight in shining armor, can ride into this chaos, disruption, broken or not broken world? And in fact, I agree with virtually everything that my fellow panelists have said. So I've been thinking, what can I add to this discussion? And perhaps we need to test a little bit some of the boundary conditions. I think looking back, frankly, rarely yields much insight, because the moment in time that Antonio Guterres arrived was Trump 1. The moment that Kofi Annan arrived was another moment, remember? He was the product of a veto of a Secretary General who thought he was going to be elected for a second term. So I think and I want to reaffirm, I also think we are not living in a broken world. I also think that, yes, the unmasking is true, Vera, but none of this is, in a sense, unknown. I think the fact that we are now feeling it so explicitly is that the one, let's say, custodian, by virtue of having been at the center of geopolitics, power politics, military might, the United States has essentially stepped back from being a semi-guarantor and custodian. And therefore, the reality that countries have, different views, different histories, a lot of contradiction, suddenly becomes, yes, more visible, but it is, as you also put it, and all of you said, nothing new. So a new Secretary General who steps into that arena, let me, in a sense, test 2 or 3 hypotheses. One, it could be the most interesting Secretary Generalship in decades, because what you're stepping into is the classic catharsis moment. Now, I don't think the United Nations will disappear. I don't think it will collapse, but the last few years have been a slow kind of drift into paralysis and polarization, to the point where the custodian power, so to speak, self-appointed in the view of many, but nevertheless it was a fact, has essentially turned on that very institution. Exit strategy, defunding, international rule of law. I mean, there is no way that out of that capital right now you could step onto the world stage and invoke that notion of international cooperation. Now, in some areas, that non-presence almost has actually allowed the rest to move forward. And let us remember, we are talking about 193 countries, and I think you made that point. More often than not, there is a very clear majority of what member states think should be happening. So a Secretary General who steps into this position on the 1st of January 2027, yes, will have probably the most intense nightmare job on their hands, but also a uniquely uncharted moment for how to begin to reestablish a narrative around international cooperation. And I think one of the interesting things may be that this increasing sense of powerlessness that a Secretary General by definition has always faced, right? Is it Secretary, is it General? You know, each one has lived it on in a different way. Well, maybe you just need to transcend that. And I think the next Secretary General perhaps should aim to have a one-term life in order to have the courage to not be intimidated by the veto in the Security Council, not to be intimidated by a sort of false economic Darwinism in geopolitics, or indeed a nuclear Darwinism in geopolitics, and actually begin to reconnect the United Nations to the only, I think, authority, no, not authority, but let's say one of you, a couple of you used the word legitimacy also, that derives from a global public opinion. Now, to many in the United Nations, in diplomacy, international relations, this would be deemed to be a naive notion. But frankly, who still switches on the television in the evening or goes on social networks and feels like the United Nations is something I believe is delivering? There's hardly anybody left, which is, as you all know, also not fair, because every day across the world, thousands of people are doing extraordinary work under the umbrella and with the mandate and with the mission of the United Nations. But at the peak, at the apex of politics, it is completely paralyzed right now. So I think the next Secretary General has to embrace this notion that they need to reestablish the role of the Secretary General as a point in a disturbed and perhaps disrupted landscape around which peoples of the world can rally. It's the only leverage you have right now in a schoolyard that is driven by power, by bullies, and so on. The second thing, I think, is re-establish the United Nations not as an institution that is increasingly obsessed by a kind of administrative and bureaucratic reform. This organization is no worse or no better than most public institutions and public national or international organizations. Its problem is not some McKinsey miracle cure of the bureaucracy. It is the political paralysis. It is the retributional psychology of politics that has turned the UN into something that few recognize right now in terms of what you need to do when the world can no longer speak to each other. You create a new center of gravity, a new voice, and I think you will not be celebrated for that in many capitals, but you will be remembered, I think, by most people in looking back in 10 years' time as the person who re-established the very essence of why the United Nations exists, and in fact, why we chose to establish it in the first place, with all the imperfections baked into it. And a last remark, Wook, why would countries vote for somebody like that? Well, because with the exception of a few of the 193 member states, all of them are yearning for precisely that kind of leadership. They don't want a behind closed doors, gray diplomacy expert. They don't want the quiet person who somehow tries to mediate, because there is not much room for mediation. We are in a moment of rupture. So how do you define the new arena in which a world will continue to have to work together? And the United Nations may not be the center of the universe, but in terms of a place where every country in the end can turn to each other because they must in order to solve a problem, there is only the United Nations that we have right now. And that does not in any way diminish other forms of multilateral cooperation, be it the African Union, be it the European Union or others. But there are certain things in our world today for which you can only mitigate your own risks and enhance your opportunity by having a way of working with everybody else.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Akim. And now we are going to go into the second round of questions, but I will insist that you limit yourself to 2 minutes, because we must leave some time for the Q&A from the audience. So I'm going to ask you brief, crisp answers. I'm going to make sure that the questions are difficult so that you can only answer in a very, very simple way. And I'm going to start with the president again, President Calderon. One of the elements of reality that we are living with today is the Danro doctrine. And obviously, the beginning of this year was very tumultuous in your hemisphere. What do you expect? What would you like the next Secretary General to say? Imagine that he were to take office on January 1, 2026. So on January 2, 2026, there was an action in Caracas. So what would you expect the Secretary General of the United Nations to say to that?
Well, what I would expect is Secretary General of the United Nations could say something and do something to avoid the massacre in Venezuela, to avoid more than 2,000 political prisoners under Maduro, to avoid the people who was killed in jail, and to say and raise the voice and action to protect real human rights before that. And of course, to reestablish international order. But international order, as I say, is broken since it's far away. Now, it's not an hypothetical thing. Let me go back to the point about the mask or not mask. It's probably yes, there is a reality. The reality is maybe we are ignoring or covering a reality in which the United Nations is not working anymore. It's not working. And it's not a question about one single action here or there, or Maduro is a criminal, he's a killer, it's an authoritarian guy, it's of course a narco trafficker. Absolutely yes. But the discussion is about the formality of the intervention of Trump. Of course, I don't like the intervention of Trump of anyone in further or another nation. But the problem is the international order must include the protection of human rights, and the human rights are not protected since several years, maybe decades ago, effectively. So what we think is the new Secretary General will keep the formality, and the formality is he or she needs to pass the potential veto, because who proposed to the General Assembly, the new Secretary General, is the Security Council. So before to be elected, needs to be the approval of Russia, China, the United States, England, and France. So it's already like conditioned in his or her action. Now, what I think is, what is happening, I hope that the Secretary General, instead of just talking about the specific case, could be a leader that could change the rules and the organism itself. The United Nations is failing. At least it's not working. And because the world is changing as well. The United Nations was created after the Second World War and was kind of equilibrium. So after a terrible war, the world reached an equilibrium, and the nations in the Security Council guaranteed that no one else was going to invade another country as the Germans did. No one else was going to ignore the international rule as the Germans did. No one else was going to do a genocide as the Germans did. Now, today, the countries inside the Security Council, they don't believe in international rules. They believe in their own political and military power and not in the United Nations. I don't say names, but think about it. Who is invading other country now? Don't say names. Okay. Russia. And Russia is inside the Security Council. Who is planning to take another land, big land in the north, and say name, is inside the Security Council. Who is planning or threatening a small island in Asia is inside the Security Council. So we have the wolf inside the, how do you say, el corral, or no? Inside the hen's house, or whatever. So we need to change that reality. That reality doesn't support any more international order. So I believe the Security Council or the United Nations could be changed, or maybe will be displaced with or without our will. The United States, for instance, announced this week that he withdrew the support to the United Nations in 31 organizations, including international health organizations, including UNFCCC, withdrew the Paris Agreement again. And maybe it implied like 1/4 of the total financial support to the United Nations. What is going to happen with that, without that? So I believe maybe a new organization is needed. Maybe the mask is completely down, you're right. So if there is nothing behind the mask, we need to organize, or you need to organize a new organization. Maybe NATO could be the root of new organization. Democratic countries, most of them, with urgency of self-protected, with no commitments, with beliefs in rule of law, most of them, committed with climate change or fighting climate change, most of them. So maybe new organization needs to jump at, but in any case, regional international organization will substitute the current situation of the United Nations. And so the problem is not exactly what the Secretary General would say in this specific case. What the human being, the nation will do with international order, which is broken, as you say.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And since you are the president, I did not want to interrupt you, but nobody else here except you is the president. So I will be trying to force the 2 minutes. Now, Kina, your country is in the Security Council right now, and your country will be one of the countries voting for the UN Secretary General in 2026. Do you expect, what are your expectations for 2026 about Pakistan's role in the UN Security Council as opposed to Pakistan's role in the Board of Peace? Where do you have higher hopes?
Okay, that was a very smart question. I think Pakistan is much more interested in its role in the Security Council because I think in the Board of Peace we all know that a group of Muslim countries, the 8 countries, the Arab countries who wanted to reach a ceasefire at any cost to stop the bloodshed under circumstances which are not of our making, decided to try and just negotiate that. And this is what the world is that we're living in. But in the Security Council, so that's the interesting part, right? Because I think I'm completely, I will again come back to the point, and I will insist on the point that when we say that the Secretary General is wrong, we're absolutely missing the point. It's not the Secretary General that is wrong. It is not the United Nations that is wrong. In fact, the narrative shaping, I don't know if everybody disagrees with me, but whether it comes to Arencha, climate change, the type of things that we talked about, this Secretary General has been absolutely clear on that, right? When it comes to the bloodshed of the Palestinians, whether you talk about the DG of the WHO or the Secretary General or Urva, they have all done the right thing. But if they're going to be voted out every time, and if they don't have an army to call, they do not have budgets which are of their own, etc., then what are we talking about? I think we've got it all wrong. We have to talk about why the will of the P5 countries, the countries which are the largest contributors, has suddenly changed from not holding order. Why do they find it? And in some ways, it's got to do with populism. Now, Pakistan's role, this is very interesting because Pakistan is generally portrayed as a country with many, many, interesting features. But we are a country which manages to get itself elected in the Security Council every 8 years or so by the broad majority of General Assembly members. Why is that? Because Pakistan has consistently been playing a very, very useful role within the General Assembly, within the, and once elected in the Security Council. We have been the largest contributor to the peace forces, etc., etc. And, when you said, that was an interesting question, who is we? The third world countries, the developing countries were not part of the we, and you're looking at your watch. So absolutely, our role, I think, has been consistent in international, in the international arena as the holders of peace, as the propagators of multilateralism, as the propagators of a democratic order. And why can't we agree to a democratic governance order? And this is, I'm just going to leave this with the younger generation. If we are willing to go to war, and this is where the masks come off, if we are willing to go to war, to kill in thousands and to be killed in thousands, okay, for the sake of democracy, then how can we admit to the fact that we are okay with the entire international order not being run democratically? So let's get out of this P5 vetoing world, trying to rearrange a bad organization, organogram, and get into a new world, and perhaps be able to rethink, as Adam Grant encourages us to do, think again.
Thank you very much. Going back to Theresia, the biggest challenges that the UN face, the top 3 for the next Secretary General from your perspective? What would those top three be and why?
When I hear challenger, I feel like I want to extend on the point that was made about legitimacy, actually, because I feel like from my experience as the youth delegate, legitimacy is the main currency of the UN. So I actually have a little anecdote because I did meet Antonio Guterres last year at the General Assembly in New York. We were meeting the Secretary General as a group of youth delegates, and it did come as a surprise to many of us that it was actually just a photo op. We were asked not to ask any questions, explicitly asked not to engage in conversation, stand still and smile for the picture. So it was quite disappointing to many of the youth delegates, and if you ask me, that's not what meaningful participation looks like. Now, to be fair, the UN has done some good things on youth involvement in the past couple of years. For example, the Youth 2030 strategy, which is system-wide, or the United Nations Youth Office, which operationalizes this Youth 2030 agenda. And that's because the member states and the UN did agree on the fact that young people need to be part of that intergenerational conversation on global crises, whether that's the solution to climate change, to the emergence of new technologies or pandemics. And they also acknowledge that youth actually need to be part of that solution. They need to be included in the decision-making on all levels, not just regional, local, national, but also the international one. So, but to be fair, the implementation of this 2030 agenda has been painfully slow, and in the case of youth delegates, it has been mostly tokenistic. There actually was a report done by UNICEF which explored the opinions of youth in multilateral spaces, and 95% of youth delegates reported that they felt like they have zero impact on policymaking inside the UN. So the reason why I'm talking about this is that youth is not just a stakeholder group at UN. They shouldn't be treated that way. Youth is the UN's future capacity, future talent, it's the UN's connection to societies, and it's the UN's credibility, and circling back to that legitimacy question. So I feel like, moreover, it's completely just irrelevant to exclude the generation that will bear most of the consequences of today's decisions. And I know I'm, again, taking maybe for too long, but see, I just believe like young people, they have hope, but they are not naive. They see the selective enforcement, they see that power politics is back. President Zelensky last week in Davos said that a world where only power counts is a very dangerous place. And even though I understand 193 member states at the UN cannot possibly agree on everything, we fundamentally should agree on the values that connect us all as a humanity, whether that's respect for human rights, whether that's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So not only do young people want to sit at the table, but for the UN to work legitimately and efficiently, they have to be sitting at that table. So legitimacy is the problem number one.
Thank you very much. Vera, there will be 3 African countries in the Security Council voting in 2026 in the process for Secretary General election. If I'm not mistaken, it's the DRC, Somalia, and Liberia. Do you expect them to be voting as a bloc in terms of all the straw polls coordinating their position? That's number one question. And number two question is, I'm sure that they're going to be working and negotiating with everybody in the Security Council, including all P5 members. But who do you think in 2026 is going to have most influence in dealing with the 3 African countries? Is it A, the United States, B, China, C, Russia, or D, UK and France?
I think it will be all of the above. And the reason I say that is because I'm an economist, and people act on incentives. And given that the vote is sacred, and we need China to process our minerals, we need the United States to give us resources, we need the French to help us get into the EU. We have incentives to say to everybody yes.
Get you into the EU?
And to get EU resources. So I think we have the incentive to say yes. I think that if we go back to economics and we look at the UN today, so the UN when it was created was foreign policy, but the world today is purely an economic world. The one guy in the room that is transacting on economics. The two guys in the room that are transacting on economics. The three guys in the room that are transacting on economics. They all understand incentive structures. I think that the new leader of the UN needs to look at what are the incentive structures for the UN to work differently. We're in a university, we can play the game theory, and figure out how is it that we begin to create systems. I think there is this now conversation, which I honestly don't believe in, how regionalism is going to work, or we're going to create variable geometry. What does variable geometry mean? Does it mean that Canada goes and becomes friends with China one day and then comes and becomes friends with NATO the other day? What is the equilibrium in that process? I don't see it. That is why we need the United Nations. But we do need a United Nations that can actually solve this incentive-compatible problem. And it is today an economic incentive-compatible problem, not a foreign policy incentive-compatible problem.
Thank you. And my last question goes to Akim. Given that international organizations, and the UN in particular, for all the reasons that we mentioned, does not come across as overly efficient and smooth place, and that 193 countries, the majority of them, will have to, solve their problems, having this as part of their reality. What do you do if you are a small country and the international organization that you belong to is not coming across as terribly helpful to what your needs are? You can, try and reform, but you are a small country. I mean, how can you contribute decisively to reform of a complex organization such as the UN, given what is going on in the world? Number two is to engage in alternative organizations, as the President suggested. Double down on your regional engagement. African Union, if you're an African country, or ASEAN, I don't know if you are from that part of the world. And number three is take matters into your own hand, do what you must, act unilaterally, because big countries do, and some small countries also act unilaterally. I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do. So if this vector of what is happening in the future is reform, alternative organizations, and unilateralism, for the next 5 years, how do you expect this mix to be relative to each other? Those three components: reform, alternative, unilateral.
Well, you set them up as alternatives. I would fundamentally challenge that, because history has taught us there are certain things you do in your country, there are certain things you do with your neighbors, there are certain things you do at a regional level, and for some things there is no alternative. And it's not necessarily a matter of are you a large or a small state. Small island developing states essentially exist on the international stage because they have the same right to the number of seats, to be heard, to speak, to articulate their national interest. And who am I telling you this? You all know that climate change is an existential threat to them. So they have banded together. They've become quite influential, as did Africa, by the way, about 15 years ago in the Climate Change Convention, because it suddenly realized that if it organized itself as a continent, its voice was suddenly significant. And I would therefore argue it's not an either-or. And I think, perhaps I only have 1 more minute, so let me also say to the room
But I did
here,
not say that these exclude each other. They're going to coexist, these three, but relative to each other, which one is going to prevail?
I think variable geometry may be an uncomfortable term. I think it will vary. But let's go back to the theme of our panel here. I mean, who is electable in this kind of arena? Well, I think if you start looking, first of all, yes, offer the world reform, but member state-led, but you have to offer a concept. I think there is virtually universal agreement that the multiplicity of entities in the UN today has simply outgrown its complementarity logic or its comparative advantage. So offer a radical, not just downsizing, but reconfiguration of the UN. That's one thing. Secondly, offer countries a way in which you can actually reinforce their capacity to act either regionally or globally on issues that really matter. AI, digital, and in many ways algorithmic security have returned to the UN. Who would have thought 2 years, 3 years ago that we would have the member states take this issue back to the UN, because there's nowhere else where you can deal with a global regulatory framework, at least, or a platform for cooperation. And in the midst of all of this, falling apart, let's remember, in the WHO, we had agreement on a new pandemic agreement. After 30 years, in the context of the law of the sea, we finally have an agreement on biodiversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction. In the IMO, we almost had a 30-year agreement until at the last minute, a couple of countries organized dissent, but it will not succeed in the long term. Multilateralism is continuing to function where countries feel it's of interest. And I think my last point is, it's to you. You're sitting here in Sciences Po. You're studying this very world that we are just discussing from different angles. Go and fight for the kind of United Nations you want rather than what you're getting right now. Because the minute you start taking this discussion back into the so-called global streets or virtual streets of the world, you start creating also political momentum. No domestic politician right now feels they have much to gain for actually investing their time in sorting out the UN, in inverted commas. So my answer would be, I think reform is an element around which all countries could agree. I think some of the strategic threats to national security, be they in the health security, be they in the technological security domain, are hyper-ripe for collective action. And again, countries can organize because it is the General Assembly with its majority that actually put a certain break on the Security Council by saying, if you use your veto in future, you will have to come and report to us. This was not a Security Council member's decision. This was the General Assembly. So I think in this world right now, maybe we will see a lot more reasons why, maybe not always 192, but certainly 160, 170 countries may actually form a very effective coalition. And that's when it suddenly becomes obvious that even the strongest economy is not almighty. It's not all powerful. It only is as long as the rest allow that to happen. And I think the United Nations, and that's my appeal to you, fight for this idea, because it is just about the only place where that majority could put up a kind of, let's say, controlling function to otherwise unbridled power. And that's not the first time in history that this has happened. So go out there and fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, over to you. Questions. Please introduce yourself, and remember that question ends with a question mark.
Thank you so much for an interesting panel. My name is Itziri Gonzalez Bárcenas. I'm Mexican, and I'm a graduate of the Human Rights and Humanitarian Action program at Sciences Po. I'll try to keep my question brief, but I do have a personal connection to drug-related violence. I've had family killed, threatened, and persecuted in rural areas of Zacatecas. And I want to contribute to making my country safer someday. And I want people like my mom, who dreams of going back to her home, but cannot because it's so dangerous, to be able to finally do so. So my question is to former President Felipe Calderón: what lessons can you draw from the extremely controversial and violent war on drugs during your administration that led to 70,000 deaths and 26,000 disappearances to apply to today's contemporary fight that's ongoing against drug trafficking organizations and operations that have only grown more complex given factors such as rising US-China tensions, the origin of the precursors for fentanyl coming from China, the use of cryptocurrency making it difficult to track cross-border payments? So what can actually really be done at the national, regional, and international level going forward? Thank you.
Good. Let's see. Well, first, the problem is not about drugs itself. The problem with the families are suffering in Zacatecas and several parts of Mexico. Now, twice as much. Though I don't know when you left Mexico, but when I left office, for instance, the violence was declining, and now there are twice as much homicides and twice as much people disappear, 50,000 in the last 6 years than before. What is the problem? The problem is organized crime is taking over the control of the families, the cities, and the society. I believe in law, and I believe that the moral duty and the main responsibility of any government is to protect families. And when you allow them to invade, to take over governments, if you resist to face them and just allow them to do whatever they want, sooner or later they will take over the control of the city. Let me explain one single case of Zacatecas. The government, the local government, you know, the family Monreal, there had been 2 governors, 2 brothers, there will be a third one. When they were governing, we seized in a property of them 14 tons of marijuana by the family ruling the state. And what did family did with your state? They passed the control of the territory of Zacatecas to the Zetas at that time. So the solution is not to avoid your responsibility to enforce the law. The solution for Mexico and a lot of Latin America is to enforce the law, face the criminal, protect the families. The debate of drugs is completely different. I could agree or disagree to legalize drugs. It's naive, by the way, to believe that this international order in which we are talking about, if you don't get a global universal solution, you never will fix that problem because the economic incentive for that will prevail. Assume that Mexico legalized drugs, actually legalized the consumption of marijuana, but the United States, the main market, don't legalize that. The price will be very, very, very high, and the incentive for black market, the states will be prevail. So, in this particular case, I believe in the violence in Mexico is not because the government decides to face the criminals. The violence is because the criminals are fighting each other, looking for territorial control. And why is that? Until 2000, the last century, Mexico was only exporting drugs to the United States. In a market, it's only the business of exporting is different from the business of retailing. When Mexico started to be middle-class country, we defeated inflation, we recovered credit and consumption, the income per capita increased, the families started, the young people in the families, whoever, started to consume drugs as well. So the new business for criminals were to take control of the territory for drug dealing in Mexico, but taking control of the corner, taking control of the town, taking control of the police. In that moment, those criminal groups started to face each other. That's the beginning of violence. And the solution that was criticized to me, say, let the criminals do whatever they want. Abrazos, no balazos, no? Hugs, not bullets, that López Obrador said that. What happened? 200,000 people were killed in Mexico in the last 6 years. 50,000 disappeared. Was it the solution? Just abandon the field? Just abandon the families in the hands of the criminal? No. You must face the criminal. You must defend the family. You need to enforce the law. That's my point of view. I respect yours. And I believe if that stream, in that way to act, will be continue after me, Mexico will be a safer place and you could go back to Mexico. I believe you can go back whenever you want, but will be to a safer place. But they abandon the politics, take those arguments against the obligation of the state to enforce the law, and Mexico is in that way for that reason. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now we're going to go to the other side, please.
Thank you so much. Recognizing that everyone in the panel is a really head of states and also public policy, how would you felt if you're a former president of a country that today comes to talk about youth generations and those youth generations in their own country, the security policies are not allowed to be back in the public sphere because of the massive aggressions, due to the violent strikes, due to the disappearance, to the fear, to the long-term trauma? how do you feel? Which kind of message will you continue giving to the young students of this university, of all the universities of the world that mostly in Latin America are afraid to go to school nowadays? Thank you.
Yes. All right, so this is a question number one, and that was a question for the president. Now, let's take another one, and maybe another one, to have three questions.
Yes.
Please.
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, Ms. Hina. My name is Anamnaz Nawaz. I am Pakistani and French. And thank you very much for this much needed discussion. It's great to see that we're discussing this topic of a broken world and an international rules-based system finally, because for the vast majority of the countries in this world, the system has been broken, the international rule system has been broken for decades. We have seen crises either involving or created by the major powers that reshaped the narratives, the rules, the attention, and the urgency. And as somebody who grew up seeing the effects of the illegal invasion of America, of the Iraq invasion by the US, because I grew up in Syria, it was very obvious for the vast majority of us that the system was broken, as we still see the war criminals roaming around after 23 years of that war. So my question has two parts. First of all, are we really witnessing the collapse of a global order, or is it more accurate to describe this as the end of a transatlantic centered order presented as universal to the rest of the world? And secondly, we've talked about what a UN Secretary General should do. I think my question is, what can he do or she do when they come to power to reduce double standards that we have witnessed for decades, and to build the legitimacy with the majority of the world who feels that the system has never really worked for them? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You just say, who did you direct the question to? The first question and the second question is for whom?
Anybody who would like to
But you
answer.
pick.
I would pick Ms. Hina. Thank you
Is
very
Hina
much.
for the first question and for the second?
And for the second, you.
Thank you. The third question.
Hello. Hi. So my question refers to, I believe it was Mr. Steiner. I could be wrong, I'm sorry. But anyway, one of the panelists was talking about this and mentioned that we require someone as in the position of Secretary General that is not necessarily seasoned diplomat as we usually think of them, and perhaps as has been the case for the last few Secretary Generals, in order to kind of adapt to the shock that the United Nations has suffered in the last, I think we called it a geopolitical recession, or something along those lines. But my question would be, because at the same time, I believe it was the same person that mentioned that the United Nations right now remains the only point of reference where countries can look to and find a stable, reliable institution. And I consider this to be a consequence of the politicization of international relations as we see it. So would a Secretary Generals that would go and take on more features that are adjacent to that very same politicization of international relations not lead to the loss of credibility that the United Nations has thus far maintained, and how we heard, I believe, from another panelist, was the key asset of the United Nations right now? Would that not risk being lost if a Secretary General would lose the characteristics that are more diplomatic as opposed to political that we've seen from the latest Secretary Generals?
Thank you very much. So, I'm going to give the...
Yeah. But again, so the question is clear. So Mexico is suffering violence. Violence is coming from the power of the criminals, organized crime, not only drugs, but organized crime, who of course is dealing with drugs, but also immigration, also prostitution, and a lot of crimes. And the problem Mexico has is that the governments abandon their duty to protect the families. And there is this idea that the better strategy to deal with organized crime is to let them to do whatever they want. And I was opposed to that idea. And I started to fight the criminals with full force of the state. And that is exactly what Mexico and America Latina needs. And it doesn't mean to break human rights. It doesn't mean to break the law. You need to use the force of the law to enforce it, to protect the families. There's no other way. And it's not a question if the drugs prevail or not. Is there drugs in France, for instance? Yes. Of course. What is the problem with the violence? Because France, Spain, UK, Germany, the United States, a lot of Islamic countries, powerful them, they have state, they have institutions, they have police, they have attorney generals.
You kill the students, you kill the families, you kill them.
They have institutions, that's the truth. And those institutions are able to work, are able to protect the families. Mexico and a lot of Latin American countries have not, that institutions have not, they are not able to enforce the law. So that's the explanation we need. To reduce the violence and to protect the family, you need a state, effective state, with institutions able to enforce the law. That strategy to allow the governments to deal with criminals with complicity, was the case of Zacatecas with Monreal. The family Monreal was in complicity with the Zetas, the criminal group, and that provoked the violence he was talking about. The only way to do this is break the complicity, enforce the law, reinforce the legal institutions, rebuild the fabric, the social fabric. That's the solution. I don't see other solution for our countries, honestly. That's the question I had. And the other is, I prefer the other members of the panel could answer because I would take a lot of, I received your signal that I took a lot of time, but about legitimacy, if business as usual, legitimacy is coming from the elections of the new Secretary General, but in my opinion, it's not enough to fix the problem. But I wonder if some of you want to answer that.
Okay, so I think that's a very simple answer, right? Was this a transatlantic order? Of course it was a transatlantic order. Was there ever, it was an order that was created after the winners of after the Second World War, and the fact that you had veto countries, etc. But the masks were still on. So when you went for wars on the question of human rights, on the question of democracy, etc., everybody sort of kept on playing the part. Countries like ours were told, if your industry dies, die, let them die, it's fine, it's not efficient, let it die. When industry on the other side of the hemisphere, starts dying, suddenly it's like, let's go to war with that country. Let's try and give sanctions on that country. Let's make it fair. So it's always been like that, but I think post the where it started showing itself on the surface was how the conduct of the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war happened, where people like us saw it blatantly. As to there were no human rights, there was Abu Ghraib, there was Guantanamo Bay. So there was rule of law within their own geographies, but absolutely no rules anywhere else. And when the absolute elements of order were weaponized, such as the human rights machinery, such as using economic sanctions selectively, and when there was no element of universality of international law and how it was applied, the rules were different for friends, the rules were different otherwise. So yes, it was always a transatlantic order, but as Carney clearly said in Davos, we all bought onto it, not on the same level as Canada and UK did, who were cheering on everything the United States of America and anyone else did. But people like us had to buy into it because we were countries which had to be, we all have to live in certain semblance of order. So yes, of course it was that order, and what we will see will again be an order which is going to be created by the powerful forces, what they choose to do. So let's not fool ourselves. The world is what it is, not what we wish it to be.
Thank you very much, and now it's my turn to answer. I really, support what you said about the rules-based order and Carney's observations. Actually, he really bought me over with that speech. I really loved the speech. I think it was like a piece of honesty that was really waited for a while. I mean, I come from a country that was on the receiving end of the rules-based order. I come from Serbia, so you know what I mean by that. But about answering directly your question as to what is it that the next Secretary General can do, my honest answer is very, very little. When I ran for Secretary General in 2016, I had a platform. I had a 53 things, concrete 53 things platform that I ran on. I said, like, if you guys elect me, these are the 53 things that I promise that I'll do to change the UN. But now the time is very, very different. You can't really fix the roof of your house when it's pouring rain. You gotta fix the roof, on a sunny day. Reform is something that you can undertake successfully under circumstances that are very different from the circumstances that you have today. So I was going through the 53 commitments that I had as a candidate for Secretary General. About 45 of them would automatically knock me out from the race today. Anything to do with sustainability, for instance, anything to do with climate. We all know that there is a veto power now in the Security Council that don't believe in these things. So I think that the next Secretary General should really start by being very honest about what is it that he or she can achieve under the circumstances. Because one of the biggest problems is that, disappointment in the UN comes from a very, very, unjustified expectations management. I think we should manage the expectations. And the expectations are that, if the next Secretary General doesn't end up being the last Secretary General of the United Nations, I'd buy in. I'd vote for a person that is not going to be the last Secretary General of the UN. Now it's Akim's turn.
I mean, I'm sure we all find ourselves on a spectrum of agreement, but I have to disagree with you, Vuk. I'm sorry. At a moment of deep crisis in terms of raison d'etre, public confidence, the ability of nations to still work together, to invite the next person to lead the United Nations who essentially starts by saying, there's not much I can do, but I'll be with you, doesn't buy it for me. I'm sorry. I urge whoever is going to run as Secretary General to embrace the notion that this is not your best career move, but it is perhaps the most important thing you will ever have done in your life. And at that moment, you begin to change the dynamic. Because if you, in a sense, surrender to the laws of political gravity right now, you will continue to reinforce precisely that dynamic. If the United Nations is to still exist and, let's say, be there 10 years from now, it is because the next Secretary General can give expression to a universal sense of frustration, but also expectation. Now, I completely agree with you. There is not a single lever they can pull. But remember, there are Secretary Generals who, in the history of the United Nations, were able to speak to the world. And at that moment, the world not only listened, but it felt spoken for. I think somewhere in there lies the energy for getting out of this inertia and broken UN or world narrative right now. But I don't want to take more time just to say on the issue of the diplomat or not, it's not whether you have to have diplomatic skills. The question is whether you're willing to go out on that trapeze without having the safety net of thinking, well, I'll say something, but then I'll go back into the second row. The next Secretary General has to live with the fact that he or she will be mistreated. I mean, if you speak to any former Secretary General, you'd be astonished at the degree of rudeness, intimidation, and sheer harassment that they have lived through for far less of a principled stand. So go in there with your eyes open, be ready to leave in a way that will not necessarily automatically put you in the history books, but maybe, just maybe, you can change the direction of what happens next.
Obviously, we would make very different recommendations to the person running for Secretary General. I personally think it is going to be the person who solves the three-body problem, being China, Russia, and the United States. Solving the three-body problem would require a lot of commitments and promises to be made that are not easily squared with the aspirational narrative that you may choose to put forward to the world. And then perhaps you're not going to be able to deliver on this thing that you will have to promise if you want to be elected. But that's just me. And I'm not running this year for Secretary General. But I want to thank you all. It was a fascinating conversation. But yes, of course, Vera, you can add something more. My boss is telling me that I better get it done.
I don't want to leave the room with a little bit of a pessimism. I actually think that Donald Trump is a great coincidence of history. Because what he has done is he has unmasked the problem. And I think that, this is so fundamentally important that has happened. And nobody else was willing to do it. Now we can all stand up and make, highfalutin speeches. But he has unmasked the problem. Donald Trump wants prosperity in America. That is what the UN wants. That is what we are all looking for. He is going about it maybe in a roundabout way. But you want prosperity in Mexico? I do. I want prosperity in Cameroon. You want prosperity in Czechia. You want prosperity in Pakistan. You want prosperity in Germany. We all want prosperity. The frustration of the world has been that we are not together fighting for that prosperity in the same place. Donald Trump came and said, why is Japan not buying American rice? And he went and fought Japan. We have been saying that for a long time. I'm sure you've been saying that too. Now the question becomes, how do we, and the next Secretary General of the United States needs to go and talk to Donald Trump. And he needs to ask him, what are your grievances? And he needs to go and talk to China. And he needs to ask China, what are your grievances? They are the two most powerful economic players in the world today. If we can figure out what those two grievances are, we can begin to build a much more peaceful space. So I really think you should not leave this room feeling, put upon. Leave this room saying, you now have the possibility to question because the mask is off. And give us answers. Give the new Secretary General answers. We do need a multilateral system. The multilateral system is the one that has taken the most people out of poverty ever. And it is the system that is going to keep us together. But we need to question it.
Thank you very much. I don't think that we could end on a better note. Thank you very much, Vera, for this really enheartening end. I want to thank you all for participation. It was a fascinating
Is it not
panel.
possible one last question?
No, it's not. So I am going to thank you all because it's a very strict,
disappeared.
it's a very strict rule, as you know, here at Sciences Po. We got to end at 8 o'clock. And I want to thank you for your questions. I want to thank you for your patience. I hope that you are leaving the room a little bit more optimistic than before.
Good evening, everyone. It is a huge honor to be here tonight to conclude this summit together with our dean. My name is Aisha Liana, and I am from Singapore. I'm a student from the first cohort of the new Master in Technology and Global Affairs at SIA. Maybe you guys could take a seat because we have like a nice poem after this. Over the past 2 days of the Youth and Leaders Summit, we explored the major challenges that will define the mandate of the next United Nations Secretary General. We discussed activism and human rights, examined the transformations driven by AI, and debated whether security or human development should come first. With the poem that I am about to share, I want to draw attention to another urgent challenge that I hope the UN leadership will take seriously, which is climate change and the environment, which has been highlighted by the panelists earlier. This poem was originally written in my mother tongue, the Malay language, and I will be reading the translation, which is called Enemy of the World. As you will be able to tell, it is greatly inspired by Greta Thunberg, one of the most powerful youth activists of our generation. Enemy of the world. How dare you? How dare you behead the forest trunks, slashing, hacking, pruning, felling, reborn as trash. After a single meal, the jungle turns into a barren field, till habitats burn day and night, wildlife scatter in fight or flight. Now no trees are left in plain sight. How dare you poison the river's mouth, polluting, seeping, tainting and venoming, opening drains where factories spout, letting toxic rainbows pour out, shells and fins surface with silvered eyes, seaborne giants falter in poisoned tides, your promises dissolve into froth and lies. How dare you rip open the womb of the earth, shoveling, blasting, mining, burrowing. Black gold is bled from every fragile map. A stolen fortune settles in your lap as drills bite deep into nature's veins. You plunder the earth for fleeting gains. Now seal your fate in lasting pain. Thank you.
So we've come to the end of the 2026 Youth and Leaders Summit. And I just thought I would leave you with a parting message after the session we've just heard. I don't think the choice is between the world as is or the world as we would like it to be. The choice is for the world we want to shape. You want to shape. That's the question. So what's the world you want to shape? What's the world we want to shape? That's the question I would put. That's a bit the question that I put to you when we started the academic year. This was 2025. This was also one of the goals we wanted to achieve with this year's summit, is to tool you with the possibility to shape that world. I have lots of thanks to give. I want to start with the speakers. They are diverse in geographies, they are diverse in background, they are diverse in political positions, they are diverse in their life experience, they are as diverse as the world you would want to shape. So let's start from there, because that's the starting point if we want to be able to shape. So let me thank them. Thank you very much for coming from near and from afar, but from spending your time sharing your thoughts with students. That's very valuable. Let me also thank the New York Times, our partner in this 11th edition. It's been 11 editions that they've been with us. And thank them also for the New York Times style debate, because that is how we learn to debate. This is how you will win the argument, not by force, but with the force of your arguments, not by canceling, ignoring, or imposing, but by convincing. That is what we have to collectively get better at. So I hope that the debate we had last night, guns or butter, will tool you now to be capable of engaging much more forcefully in shaping the world. Because let's face it, this is not about friends or foes. We heard this morning from the prime ministers of Denmark and Greenland what it is like to deal with an ally. This is much more complicated than that. The world is more nuanced, so it's about unpacking all these nuances. That's how we will get there. We've heard a lot about the limits of international governance, actually of any form of governance. The limits are whether or not you want to respect the rules that you have agreed to respect. And if you don't, internationally, that's a limit. But we've also heard a lot about solutions, about alternatives, about changes. that can make this governance, even in this very broken world, work and serve us a little bit better. Let me thank also volunteers, all the red shirters in the room. A big applause to them. It's the tradition of the house that students do the hard work for the Youth/Leaders Summit. That's the new name we've agreed for the next edition. Thank you for that. I hope you had as much fun as I had watching you operate. Thank you for that. Thanks also to the PSIA team. I know there is a lot of small hands, but I know there is Julia behind that, there is Sofia behind that. There is lots of hands that work to deliver these sessions, these 2 days of sessions to you. We are not done. There are now some breakout sessions where you can sit with leaders of your choosing, and we are not done because Monday we have another interesting conversation about the Monroe Doctrine and the corollary of the Monroe Doctrine seen from China with Professor Zhang Yongle from Beijing University. So watch this space. Thank you for being with us. Hope it's been helpful to all of you. If not, the box of recommendations, suggestions to improve for next year is open. Thanks again, and take the rest of the day off.